Hello everyone, welcome back to another lecture in the carbonate equilibria model or module. I am Professor Bergstrom, and in this particular lecture we're going to talk about environmental influences on our carbonate equilibria. So by the end of this video, students should be able to, given a parameter, make predictions on how it will shift the balance of carbonate species. So before we dive in, really quickly, just want to run through our relationship between DIC and pH and how our carbonate species shift over that. So we have our carbonic acid, which is both CO2 and carbonic acid, and that is at highest concentrations at our lowest pH. But then as we increase our pH and increase our OH, we're going to start to dissociate those hydrogen ions and move into high concentrations of bicarbonate. So remember, in our circumneutral pH natural waters that we have, we're dominated by bicarbonate. Then as we increase our pH even more, we will move into being dominated by carbonate itself. So we can see alone how changing pH has an effect on our carbonate species, but this is in a pretty simple world where everything is mostly just focused on pH and our DIC species' ability to resist that change in pH. However, if we go out into the world, we know that there's way more things going on, and there's a wide variety of physical and biological processes that can influence this carbonate balance. So, for example, we have here the confluence of the Suwannee and Santa Fe rivers in Florida, and we can just see visually that there's two very different types of water and water quality we have going on in these two rivers. We can also see some algal blooms and potentially pollen floating in there. So we know not only do we have things like our dissolved solids in our rivers and potentially things like temperature affecting the mixing, we have biological influences in here too. And then similarly, if we look at a soil, this is a soil profile in Patagonia. For one, we know that we have vegetation along the top here. We have water moving in and percolating down through our soils. We also have maybe some changes in the chemistry of the material in the soils, and we can see we have some gradients that's shown very clearly by our color gradients that we have here across this soil profile. So chances are our carbonate balance is going to be changing along a soil profile, and that's a function of all of these different factors that are occurring in our soils. So we're going to run through each of those, but a nice way to think about it is using the equilibrium reaction for calcium carbonate. So that equilibrium reaction is this. So we have CaCO3, that's calcium carbonate, plus our carbonic acid, H2CO3, and this is the combination of both CO2 and carbonic acid, just to remind you guys. So that is in equilibrium with our calcium ion, 2+, and our bicarbonate, and it's 2 bicarbonate, because we need to balance out our charge here. So we can look at this left-hand side of the equation here and see that because both calcium carbonate and carbonic acid are on the same side, that means they have a negative relationship. And what I mean by that is if, for example, our CO2 were to increase in solution, that means our calcium carbonate would have to decrease to balance out that increase in CO2 and keep the whole system in equilibrium. Okay, so a nice example of this is the dissolution or exsolution of CO2. So we know that groundwater has higher dissolved CO2 concentrations, and that happens for a number of reasons. So groundwater can pick up CO2 from decaying organic matter. as well as the respiration of roots and microbes. And so if that CO2 that's released from decay and respiration isn't released to the atmosphere, it's going to continue to concentrate in our groundwater. Another thing is groundwater is always under pressure, so that increased pressure will keep that CO2 in solution in our groundwater. So when that CO2-rich groundwater reaches the atmosphere, it's going to try and equilibrate with the atmosphere, which means that our CO2 in solution is going to decrease. And because we have that negative relationship with calcite, we're going to increase our calcium carbonate, which is causing that precipitation of calcite and making these calcite deposits. So that's why you see these calcite deposits when groundwater reaches the atmosphere. So places like hot springs and places like caves. That's one of the reasons why we get those calcite deposits, is because we're exsolving CO2 from our water, decreasing our CO2 concentrations, which is resulting in our increase in our calcium carbonate or other carbonate species. There's also a relationship with temperature, which we'll talk about in a few slides. So the next thing is biological processes. So we have organisms in our water, and those organisms can both consume and release CO2. So CO2 consumption generally happens by photosynthesizers, and those photosynthesizers are active during the day. And so our CO2 consumption and CO2 concentrations are generally lowest during the day, and then they increase at night when those photosynthesizers are no longer consuming CO2. So we can see this is a time series over the course of a month, and this is our partial pressure of CO2 in our stream. So we can see we have these daily cycles of CO2 concentrations within our stream. And of course, like we just talked about, if we're changing our CO2 concentrations, that's going to affect the balance of everything else in our carbonate system. And this is just shown very clearly on this box plot. We can see during the day in the summer, our CO2 flux is much lower relative to during the night when there's nothing consuming that CO2. So we tend to have more CO2 being released to the atmosphere. So this is one example of biological processes controlling this concentration of CO2 and thus cascading throughout our carbonate equilibrium. The next thing is this idea of ion activity. And so if we have higher ion activity in our water, generally we can't dissolve as much CO2 in our water. So those ions are bumping around and interacting with our hydroxide and our hydrogen ions, and those hydroxide and hydrogen ions can't interact with CO2 and pull CO2 into solution. So these relationships are a little bit more predictable when you only have one type of salt, for example, just sodium chloride, but we know that is generally not true in nature. We have lots of different ions, and so it gets much harder to predict when we have different salts. And some of the reasons why we care about ion activity, so for one example, there's been a lot of research around taking CO2 and sequestering it by pumping it into deep groundwater. But we know frequently our deep groundwater is very briny, and those brines can be very different. So the whole idea, the process, is taking this CO2 gas, pumping it into the groundwater, having it dissolve in the groundwater, moving along our carbonate equilibrium, and eventually precipitating out as some solid carbonate. However, if we have these different brines, we might not be as effective at moving our CO2 into solution and along that carbonate equilibrium. Another example of why ion activity matters is in the ocean. So obviously the ocean has quite a bit of salt in it, but that salinity changes depending on where you are in the ocean, the temperature of the ocean, which we'll talk about in the next slide here, as well as the pressure of the ocean. So that ion activity or that salinity is going to affect our ability to dissolve CO2 and once again move along our carbonate equilibrium. And that will affect everything from how the ocean can buffer acidity to the ability for calcium carbonate shelled organisms to maintain their shells. Okay. So then the last thing that I want to talk about is temperature. So like we talked about in earlier lectures, the ability for CO2 to dissolve into water is a function of both pressure and temperature. So if we have increases in temperature, our CO2 is going to be less soluble. And once again, going back to thinking about that carbonate equilibrium, if our CO2 is less soluble, that means we have less CO2 in our water, and we're more likely to have calcite precipitating out. So our carbonate solubility is also decreased with our increase in temperature. And so these temperature and salinity effects are summed up nicely in these figures. So we have pressure on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, this is the important part here. This is our molar concentration of CO2. And so each of these lines in this figure on the left here is the different temperature of the water. And so this is increasing temperature as we move across these lines, and we can see as we increase our temperature, we're decreasing our concentration of CO2 in the water. And then on this figure here, each of these lines is the concentration of sodium chloride, which of course is going to dissolve into sodium and chloride ions when they are in water. So if we increase our concentration of sodium chloride, we're going to once again decrease our concentration of CO2. So both increasing temperature and increasing salinity will decrease our CO2, and once again, that will cascade along our carbonate equilibria and affect the relative balance of each of our carbonate species. Finally, like we talked about at the very beginning of this lecture with the mixing of two different waters, that can result in changes in our carbonate system in very hard to predict ways. And one of the reasons why is there's all sorts of factors that can come into play when waters are mixing. So all of the processes that we were talking about in this lecture can be a part of these different waters mixing. So thinking about surface water versus groundwater mixing, our groundwater is likely going to be at a different temperature than our surface water, possibly colder, possibly warmer. Our total dissolved solids and the number of ions we have, or the concentration of ions in the water, is going to be different between our surface water and our groundwater. And so frequently we tackle the mixing of two different waters and what is going to happen with our carbonate species with modeling in order to handle all of these complex processes. So mixing and carbonate equilibria is really important in big ways. For example, like we just talked about, mixing of surface water and groundwater, estuaries, the mixing of fresh and saline water, and then things like leaking sewage. So if you have a leaking septic tank or some sort of even the outflow of a wastewater treatment plant, you might have things like high organic matter and high total dissolved solids, which when the organic matter, for example, is oxidized, it's going to create CO2, which is going to affect that balance. And other things like nutrients could spur biological activity, which will then change that balance of oxygen and CO2 in your water.